I'm Alex. I'm a third-year PhD candidate from the West University of Timișoara, and it is my great pleasure and honor to chair this session today, where our speaker is Ms. Sophie Maríñez. She is a professor of modern languages and literature at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, where she recently won a Distinguished Teaching Award, so congratulations for that. She is also an affiliate professor for the PhD program in French at the Graduate Center and regularly teaches as a visiting faculty member for the MA in the Study of Americas at City College's Division of Interdisciplinary Studies. Her research lies at the intersection of history, literature, and music, and other cultural productions from the Francophone and Spanish-speaking Caribbean and their respective diasporas. It underscores Afro-diasporic decolonizing thought and aesthetics, collective memories, and literary and musical work that transcends dominant notions of race, ethnicity, gender, and national identity. Her new book, Spirals in the Caribbean, Representing Violence and Connection in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, has received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ms. Maríñez.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Eve, for inviting me to this wonderful seminar. And thank you, Alexandru, for chairing the event, and to everyone for signing up and being here today. So I'm going to start right away by giving a little bit of a breakdown of what this lecture will be today. It draws from a chapter in my book, Spirals in the Caribbean, that connects the dots between the genocide perpetrated in 1937 against the Black population living in the borderlands with Haiti, the constitutional reforms made in 1929, and ruling 168-13 issued by the Constitutional Court of the Dominican Republic, which denationalized hundreds of thousands of Dominicans of Haitian descent, effective retroactively to 1929. The 1929 reforms, I contend, established the nation as a fundamentally anti-Haitian state, laid the groundwork for the 1937 genocide, and recur in anti-Haitian legislations and state-sponsored violence perpetrated against Haitians and Black Dominicans to this day. I also argue that the Dominican nationalist trope of a peaceful invasion serves to mask a pervasive ambition over Haiti itself, territorial, political, and economic, as the importation of its quote-unquote cheap labor reveals. Far from destroying the Dominican Republic, Haitian workers have built its wealth. However, constitutional restrictions since 1929 have ensured their descendants never access the nationality, at least not by birthright. I will briefly describe the spiral as an interpretative tool that I use to examine literary and cultural productions that reflect interrelated episodes of violence and national narratives. And finally, I will discuss Haitian perspectives that represent a reality of historical alliances and solidarity, cultural mixedness, and kinship among both populations. That is why Haitian survivors call the genocide Kout Kouto instead of the misnomer Pîrciu massacre, to describe what they experienced, a devastating betrayal by those they thought were their friends and siblings. So, briefly described, Spirals in the Caribbean responds to the human rights crisis fueled in 2013 with the Constitutional Court ruling 168-13. Spiral finds that in the Dominican Republic, anti-Haitianism emerges from three foundational moments of violence that constitute the primary material of nation-building narratives on both sides of the island. The first of this moment is the Haitian Revolution, which is the pride of Haitians, but which led colonial powers to demonize Haiti. In the Dominican Republic, this demonization takes the form of a cannibal figure, among other figures, but the one I focus on my book is the comegente, or people eater, which I discuss in the first chapter. The second moment of foundational violence is the genocide perpetrated by Trujillo against Haitians and Afro-Dominicans, which I discuss in chapter 2. And the third moment is chronologically the first, the decimation of the native population, a past that recurs with opposing variations in national discourses of both sides of the island, and which I discuss in chapters 3 and 4. So Spirals brings a decolonial vision of narratives that keep returning and expanding into folk tales, literary works, spiritual practices, and musical traditions, including Afro-Indigenous material that emerge, for instance, in the music of Luis Terror Diaz, in which I discuss in my book and in an article that is forthcoming in Small Acts. So, very quickly, the shape of the spiral inspired spiralism, a literary aesthetic developed in the late 60s under the Duvalier regime by Haitian writers Franck Etienne, Philoctete, and Fignolet. Spiralism is made of anaphoras, cycles of repetitions with a difference, intensifications, rencontres mystérieuses or junctions among seemingly disparate events, and denunciation of violence, political corruption, and social injustice. Crucially, and contrary to other thinkers in the Caribbean like Césaire, Glissant, and Chamoiseau, the spiralists refused to theorize national identity in terms of race, language, geography, and that is why I find it so universal, so appropriate to extend it as an hermeneutical tool to countries other than Haiti, countries that don't have a long-standing historical relationship with France or French, like the Dominican Republic. So Franck Etienne writes, the spiral is a movement from the bottom to the top, from the simple to the complex. And in each turn, each spiral structure is deeper and richer than the last one. The spiral defines the perpetual movement of life and of all evolving things. It is characteristic of dialectics. So they also notice that the shape of the spiral appears in nature, like the conch shell, galaxies, and hurricanes. Like Engels in the 19th century and Gilles Deleuze in the 20th century, the spiralists noticed that social realities too evolve like a spiral, repeating with a difference across time, not exactly in the same way, but incorporating changes. Spiralism anticipates the vocabulary used by other thinkers in the Caribbean, like Kamau Brathwaite, Benitez Rojo, Repeating Island, and Edouard Glissant's writing practice. Building on all this and the work of other scholars of spiralism like Kayama Glover, Rachel Douglas, and others, I extend the spiral to analyze reality, not just in Haiti, but across the entire island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I use it as an interpretive tool to examine literary and cultural productions on interrelated episodes of violence and narratives. So, just to get started, I'm going to give a very quick historical timeline. There were many treaties between France and Spain in the 17th century when Spain recognizes the existence of the French colony in the western side of the island. But what matters for our purposes today are the 1777 Treaty of Aranjuez, which defined the colonial territories. I included this map because, as you can see, and the border is very different from what it is today. And this whole region here in the north, in what is the valley of Artibonite, will be a territory of contention in 1929, and as I will show later. So pay attention to this border. And then this Treaty of Aranjuez was nullified in 1795 by the Treaty of Basel, which unified the entire island under France. So what is today the Dominican Republic used to belong to France from 1795 until 1809 in what is known as La Era de Francia. Then, of course, as you know, Haiti became independent in 1804. The island became unified under Haiti in 1822 when slavery was abolished across the whole island. In 1844, the Dominican Republic separated from Haiti. And then there was a quick moment of reversal of the Dominican Republic back to a colonial state during the annexation of Spain. So in 1863-65, there was the War of Restoration of the Dominican independence from Spain and a new constitution that established jus solis in very democratic terms. In 1929, two reforms of the Dominican Constitution took place, which affected the territory, the clause on territory, and the clause on nationality. And that's the first time that they insert the in-transit clause that we will see in 2013 with the court ruling known infamously as La Sentencia. So instead of the term border, which implies one static, a historical geographical line allegedly dividing both populations, I refer to this area as Center Island, a term coined by historian Anne Eller to describe a region constituted by networks and circuits of communication, trade, and transportation between these two populations. These circuits always existed since the early colonial moment, but in the 19th century, they involve land and sea in the northern region, where Puerto Plata and Cap Haitien are connected by land and sea. Michel Beau also described a geopolitical reality in this area, the vertical circle here, which he described as fiercely resisting authorities from both sides, the Port-au-Prince and Santo Domingo, constituting a very autonomous region that both sides, both authorities found very difficult to control and were very annoyed and tried everything to control later with the border. Then in the lower horizontal circle between Port-au-Prince and Assois, this reflects a circuit of trade and communication that served rebellions ever since the first moment of colonization in the area known as the Bauruco region. Historians Richard Turrets and Robin Derby also documented this central region here as populated by a bicultural, bilingual population tightly knit through kingship, commerce, political, and social interests. So the massacre perpetrated in 1937 resulted in the violent death, maiming, and exodus of tens of thousands of Haitians and Afro-Dominicans. Women were raped, bodies were burned and decapitated, and corpses were left to decompose out in the open. As news of the massacre scandalized the international community, Trujillo downplayed its extent and his responsibility by dismissing it as a reaction of local farmers against petty thefts allegedly done by Haitians. So, understandably, the first reaction by the first wave of observers and historians downplayed the role played by civilians and fiercely denounced Trujillo's orders as a decision to impose his power over the population. But recent historians, namely Eddie Paulino, have documented the extent to which civilians participated. Many were coerced, while others did it willingly, blindsided by anti-Haitian propaganda. Sabine Cadeau also argued for exploring the fundamental role played by the United States, which occupied the island in the first third of the century, inserting a new layer of anti-Black racism and establishing migratory laws that set the tone for anti-Haitian legislations. She declares 1930 the year in which Trujillo took power as a turning point that laid the ground for the genocide. Finally, the Haitian perspective is one of shock at the violence perpetrated by those they thought were their friends and neighbors. That's why the term Kout Kouto is so appropriate, because it reveals both the killing method with a machete and the allusion to stabbing someone in the back, that is a betrayal from someone you know and trust. Following Sabine Cadeau's emphasis on 1930, I step back 1 year earlier and consider the two constitutional reforms taking place in 1929, which lay bare the role of Dominican politicians who reformed the Constitution twice to attack Haitians as citizens. The first reform took place in January that year, when politicians decided they wanted to reclaim the land lost, quote unquote, lost to Haiti, and reconfigure the border along the old Treaty of Aranjuez, which, as you saw earlier, included an enormous chunk of land in the Artibonite region of Haiti. The constitutional reform added a disposición transitoria to allow room for the new border to be traced accordingly. One of the congressmen warned them, what if Haiti gives us all that land? What are we going to do with the inhabitants? He was referring to the recent Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I in Europe, transferred massive chunks of German territory to neighboring countries, and instituted what is known today as the rights of minorities. This principle established that the population of these transferred lands were minorities of their new nation state and had the right to maintain their languages, customs, beliefs, and cultural practices. This right of minorities was very problematic for the Dominican Republic, this congressman said, because we will have to respect this principle and grant these residents the right to maintain their culture. In other words, the right to maintain their Blackness. So a few days later, both presidents signed the treaty. No one spoke about the nationality or rights of minority, and soon later, the border was traced on the ground. As soon as that was done, they met again. But here is what the previous constitution had established since, for years, that it was a very democratic jus soli, as you can see, all born on Dominican territory. Even those born from foreigners had the right to Dominican nationality. That was before the second change, which they made in June. Now, a few months later, once the border is duly traced, given generous portions of land to the Dominican state, congressmen reformed the constitution again, inserting a new restriction to those born on Dominican soil from parents deemed in transit. When one of the congressmen representing Santiago protested against this in-transit restriction, another one representing the province of Azua in the south said, we must do this because these are people que cruzan pero no se detienen, who cross but don't stop or are not detained, which I find is a very interesting choice of words, since cruzar alludes to mobility over land, not over maritime transportation or flights, which didn't exist at the time. Back then, the term in transit did not refer to passing travelers who came by sea, but to Haitian individuals who kept coming and going, many of them merchant women or marchantas, which is a point that shows how anti-Haitian practices are heavily gendered in the Dominican Republic. Women are the primary target. In other words, they want the land, but not the people. The first reform recaptured the land from Haiti. The second denies the nationality to the residents of this very land and to the children of any person coming from Haiti. here is a constitution that establishes the state as fundamentally anti-Haitian. So Haitian writer Jacques Roumain was the first to denounce the genocide, which he described as less the product of a racial difference or antagonism between Haitians and Dominicans, as Trujillo was claiming, and then that of the complicity between Trujillo and Haitian President Sténio Vincent, both of whom he saw as representatives of fascism in the Caribbean. Roumain's essay set the tone for the novels published in the following 2 decades, including Anthony Lespèce's Les Semences de la Colère, which focuses on the disastrous attention Haitian authorities gave to returning survivors, which is in itself a betrayal, and Jacques-Stéphane Alexis' Compère Général Soleil, which emphasized the solidarity of politically conscious Dominicans. René Philoctete incorporated these views and zoomed in the cultural proximity of the population of the Center Island, and I'll discuss him a little later. By contrast, Edwige Danticat, whose widely known novel The Farming of Bones was published in the late 1990s, when anti-Haitian rhetoric and state policies were again on the rise, emphasizes an image of antagonistic, mutually exclusive identities. Finally, Roxane Gay's short story In the Manner of Water or Light is similar to Danticat's short story in 1937, as it focuses on this unresolved mass murder as a collective trauma that keeps haunting the island and its diasporas for generations. In Compère Général Soleil, Alexis draws from a Marxist perspective to disaggregate Dominicans according to their ideologies. Some are fascists and follow Trujillo's orders with glee. Some are communists or progressives and help the Haitian workers the best they can. And finally, others are the so-called neutral people, those who become complicit with their silence. Most importantly, he sees both populations as siblings joined by their cultural proximity, as well as the joys and tribulations of everyday life and a shared experience of oppression. That's why, because of this siblinghood, the massacre appears not only as a betrayal, but as evoking the biblical murder of Abel by his brother Cain, as the fraternal blood staining the soil of the island will remain forever an infamous stain, a shame for generations of Dominicans who will bow their heads when recalling the massacre. Since no one ever was prosecuted for the crimes committed, the genocide remains a moral responsibility that, if we keep on with the biblical metaphor, and for those who believe in the afterlife, the criminals will have to account for either with themselves or with a higher entity. Betrayal always involves deep internal shame and eventually self-hatred for having committed these crimes. No confrontation with justice on earth, no resolution of any kind, means not only that the victims never found justice, but that the perpetrators and witnesses will forever have to deal with their internal guilt. One form of dealing with it is by projecting the blame onto the victim. That's why we hear the expression, cuidado con el haitiano que te va a llevar si te portas mal. Careful with the Haitian who's going to take you away if you misbehave. A parenting tool, questionable parenting tool, that has inculcated anti-Haitianism since childhood and is so prevalent, but it also reflects fears of retaliation by the survivors of the massacre who will come back and take their children. So, as many of you already know, Danticat's novel Farming of the Bone has characters divided between victims and perpetrators, Haitians and Dominicans, with little room for the multi-ethnic mixed communities of the Center Island. I argue that Dantica's pessimistic approach is warranted until the Dominican state reckons with its historical responsibility. There is little room for redemption. As a spiralist novel, Philoctète, Le Peuple des Terres Mêlées, which means the people of the mixed lands, but was translated in English as Massacre River, is the most complex in style and structure. He starts by emphasizing the mixed community of the Center Island, represented by a loving couple, the Dominican Pedro Brito and his Haitian wife, Adèle Benjamin. Then the massacre takes place with a personified machete that takes the lead with a life of her own and destroys this community. Like Alexis, Philoctète emphasizes solidarity, but like Jacques Roumain, he also takes to task Haitian authorities who constantly betray their own people. He also reverts one of the old stereotypes that depict Haitians as people eater or comegentes or cannibals and redirects this stereotype back to the perpetrators who appear in the novel as chomping away the bodies of their victims. Since no trial ever took place or took the murderers to justice, the unresolved mass murder has produced ghosts. In Philoctète's novel, Adèle is decapitated by the machete, but her head keeps rolling alive, trying to find her body and put herself together. She also speaks to other Haitian heads that keep rolling and like ghosts haunting the island that never buried them properly and that never gave them closure. In 2011, a group of artists, writers, and activists put together an annual commemoration called Borders of Light, headed by Cynthia Carrion, Julia Alvarez, Edwige Dantica, Megan Myers, Edwin Paulino, and many others who every year commemorate the victims at the border. This is a much-needed private initiative, but we need to go further and pressure the state to, as was done with the Shoah in post-Nazi Germany, recognize its historical responsibility, ban all forms of hate speech, and prosecute hate crimes against Haitians. Unfortunately, right now, the Dominican state itself is the primary perpetrator of hate speech and hate crimes, sponsoring the persecution, kidnapping, and extortion of thousands of Haitians every week under the name of deportations. In sum, the spiral connects the dots between 1929, the 1937 genocide, the 168-13 court ruling, and today's anti-Black state-sponsored persecutions. It recognizes and draws from Haiti's creative and intellectual contributions to consider the spiral as a tool that can be extended across the island and by extension, the entire Caribbean. More broadly speaking, it invites more research in comparative studies across time, languages, and disciplines. And that's the end of my talk today. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Sophie. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. And I see we already have a question here in the chat from Miss Grayson. She asks, should I read it out loud or do you want to read it yourself? Okay, she asks, she said, thank you for your talk. How does spiralism relate, if at all, to Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence?
Well, I am not knowledgeable of this concept of slow violence. So if you could explain, I would be happy to engage.
Okay, while she does, I also have one question of my own, if you will allow it.
Yeah.
Because you talked in the beginning that it's threefold, the violent circle, so to say, the violent circle in the island of Hispaniola. It started with, but you put this at the third space, with the genocide of the indigenous people, then with Haiti's founding, and this is what I'm interested in. because you said this was very hated by colonial powers, and this I read of. And did they actually start this hearsay, so to say, that Haitians are people eaters and stuff like that? Because this is very important for my analysis. Because Edwin Cat also mentions this in the novel you analyze, the farming of bones. At one point, there's a group of people who are signaled out by the Dominicans as Haitians, and they tell their children that they eat people. And maybe this is then echoing the hate speech of the colonial times. Would you agree? Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, in the first chapter of my book, I talk about how anti-Haitianism began the very minute that Haiti became a nation, because slave-owning powers, of course, were, devastated that they lost their slaves, and also did not want Haiti to be an example for other slaves in the Americas. And so the trope of eating people is one that recurs throughout the 19th century, with a difference, always different. And even today we see it in electoral politics in the US, modified with the form of pet eaters, right? Because now today it's too gruesome to say that they eat people, the cannibals, it's harder to believe, but to say that they eat pets is perhaps more believable, more plausible, and also scarier for people who care about their pets, which was rich coming from J.D. Vance, because a few weeks earlier he had criticized people who had cats. So there is an issue. He has an issue here. Okay.
I even read, I think Trullo was the one who said it, but don't take my word for it, that the colonizing powers could not even comprehend, could not bring into their reality this narrative that Haitian was now a free country. They could not assimilate, interiorize that in a way. It was so hard for them to. And I see here, Miss Grayson, detailed, if you would allow me, I would read it now.
Yes.
Nixon talks about multiple interrelated instances of violence, including against the environment, but focuses on what is not spectacular or highly visible, but acts slowly and therefore goes unnoticed. The example you've given seems both under the radar in the documents and spectacularly visible, the genocide machetes of 1937. Perhaps spiralism is more about the form of the spiral and the increase in intensification. Could you speak more about that?
Yes, well, spiralism is intensification, and it is related with Gilles Deleuze's notion of repetition with a difference, which also talks about intensification. But yes, definitely, they also account for rencontres mystérieuses, like connecting, things that are seemingly disparate, right? Like a constitution and the in-transit clause. It seems, like you said, slow violence, unnoticeable, very, very under the radar, but it lays the ground for physical, visible violence. So yes, I agree that there is a connection, and thank you for bringing that up for me.
I see that Rachel has raised her hand, so I'm going to bring her in so she can ask a question. Rachel?
I apologize. That was an accident.
Oh.
Okay, so maybe would it be okay, Alex, if I ask the question now? Yeah, just to say, sure. I'm obviously a fan, so I've got your book here, and I'd recommend. It's just been released, and recommend please do try and get your hands on it. I've really enjoyed your work. Obviously, the concept. I mean, it's really what's needed is, as we've heard time and time again, about new narratives on the island, and specifically any attempt for me, I think, to kind of override more traditional forms of talking about race, language, and geography, as you said, I think are just so needed, especially. And I know that you're greatly inspired by Anella's work, and obviously Paulina's work, and many others. But that's what I'm really interested in, is this way of circumventing the kind of traditional discourse or traditional way of looking at this, which is often falls into a legalistic discourse as well, right? About understanding the sentencia and kind of its impact and where it came from. But really what we need is creative thinking around this. And I think that's very much where the engagement with Haitian and Dominican literature and beyond, and especially theorizing about this kind of way beyond kind of the traditional means, is just absolutely fantastic. And that is what the contribution for me that your book makes and what plays out of the water. But the question that I have is, I really love that, as you know, Luis Diaz, the fact that you've put El Terror in your book is just fantastic. He was a great inspiration to so many, and somebody who I spent a lot of time with and whose music lives on. I'm also very proud because in my own book, I managed to quote the lyrics of Toque Profundo, which is a Dominican rock band who are like my favorite people. So can you talk a little bit more about why you brought in Luis's music, his work, his poetry, his passion as well, right, for kind of really offering this kind of counter narrative and dispelling a lot of the nonsense really that's talked about the island. Where did that inspiration come from, and kind of how did that inform your writing of the book?
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking that question. I'm so glad, because when I was in the Dominican Republic growing up in the 1980s, the anti-Haitian rhetoric was dormant. It was because there was no internet, no social media like today, and Haitian migrants were pretty much confined to the batalles. Those of us living in the city were not exposed to that rhetoric on a daily basis like today, even though anti-Haitianism has always existed at the state level and elite level. But when the court ruling happened in 2013, it came to me almost like a surprise. Like, really? Is that who we are, Dominicans? So hateful? And that's not what I remembered. And then one day, here in Washington Heights, a group of fans decided to have a street named after him, after Luis Diaz, and they did an homage to him. And that brought me back to the 1980s, when I was a teenager and when I was frequenting this circle of artists and writers, because I was myself an actress, and that's in my previous life. And I was very close friends with Luis and Laura, his wife, and went to his concerts, and everywhere in the La Zona Colonial and other places. So it was part of my lived experience as a Dominican person. That's what it was, right? Anti-establishment, anti-colonialist views, anti-imperialist views. And I also come from a home where social justice was an important value. So, and also his ways being, his style, living like a punk, and his, steaming at the, all his tight jeans and his hairstyle. I even shaved my side of my hair to look like him. I was a big fan. So when I'm here in New York, that was like thinking 2018 that they did this homenaje a Luis Diaz, and they played all those songs and by him who passed away in 2009. I was devastated, remember him and missing him a lot, but at the same time, it reminded me that's the quote unquote Dominicanidad that I want to talk about. This is the Dominican that I remember.
Exacto.
But we need to remind who we are. Anti-establishment, anti-imperialist.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of that, because okay, I'm not going to let this collapse into kind of a nostalgic.
Sorry.
But, great. No,
what I wanted to do.
But growing up in Santo Domingo, right, in the 2000s, it was exactly the same, right? But it was reliving that, for me, the passion for me of getting into academia and writing about the Dominican Republic was always that thing that there were always multiple voices, right? And there were also, there are multiple Dominicanidades and multiple experiences, and most of them are not written about or understood about, right? So this idea of this kind of Haitian Dominican binary, I find so reductive and so sad, because you've got you've got the transnational lives of Dominicans, you've got what's happening cross-border lives, you've got people's history and culture and the intermixing and the way that all of these things speak to one another as well. And there's such a richness there that I don't know how you even begin to even do it justice, right, by putting it on the written page. It's something that has to be lived and has to be loved and kind of and shared. So I just want to say thank you for writing about Luis, because he was so central to so much of that movement and so much of that passion, right, that is kind of that you see that is coming through in your work as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we still have 2 questions in the chat, and I think I'm going to let the people in so they can ask themselves. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, the first one is from Mr. Steve Holguin. I'm going to let him in now. Okay, Mr. Holguin, you can ask your question. If you're still there. Okay.
Yes. I guess my question, first and foremost, one to begin with, is to say thank you for your work and your dedication, and that it's immensely needed and appropriate for the current times, as you've mentioned, but to also draw the connections of the history and the very pertinent connections that you make with the creation of these borders, and especially connecting it to the present atrocities occurring on the island, especially on the side of the Dominican Republic. And so my question I wanted to ask refers to like drawing comparisons to other studies. And in the question, I brought up genocide studies, but then also like either other countries such as Germany, which you've mentioned, that have had some kind of accountability with the Western, I said Western imperialist, but essentially a Western entities such as the UN, like not having UN pressure for to show accountability for atrocities, specifically genocides committed, as we are seeing multiple happen in different continents. But could you elaborate maybe on some countries or even studies or disciplines that you have thought to bring into comparison, or that you have often talked about in the same breath when speaking to the Dominican Republic, and not just the 1937 genocide, but the multiple atrocities?
Yeah, I mean, the genocide studies is really not my field. Edward Paulino is the expert on this. He has done more comparative work on the on different genocides across the world. But yes, even the term genocide, right? I'm learning that it has its restrictions. You have to have certain conditions that were imposed by the UN to qualify as a genocide. Apparently, there is a bunch of rules, but I don't need the UN to give me permission to call the Kout Kouto a genocide, because that's what it was. I don't need, and and I don't need the UN to give me permission to call what was done to the indigenous population a genocide, or what is happening today in Gaza. We don't need permission. So I did put more comparative work in my earlier draft of this chapter with the Shoah, especially. I didn't want to do too much, then I removed because I didn't want to make it too much about that. But especially the part of, I don't know if I left it, maybe it's still there. The part where I discuss the killing methods, and I compared the machete with the gas chambers, right? The gas chambers create a distance, physical and emotional distance. You don't really see how the people are dying. So that is maybe easier to do, right? Whereas a machete, you are like involved, your body is involved, your emotion, you are both a perpetrator and a witness, and sometimes there can be a fight if the person fights back. So it's a lot more visceral, right? And requires a lot more personal investment. So that's a little bit of the comparison that I did. Also, there's a comparison with the names that were used, since there was a controversy or a debate over using Holocaust and Shoah, the word used by the victims themselves for what it was. And I felt, we should use the word, in the Haitian Dominican context. There have been so many names, like Pîrciu massacre, which is a misnomer, El Corte, which is used by the Dominican side, to refer to the moment of harvesting the plants, and which is kind of an analogy with Haitians being plants that you need to cut out, yank out, right? And then you have La Matanza, which is the killing, which is very generic. It could be animals too. La Matanza de los puercos cimarrones, use the same word. So I like Kout Kouto because it's really the word that used by the survivors themselves. So that's a way of honoring the victims and the survivors by their own perspective, their own way of how they experienced it. And also it is a play on words, right? It's both the tool that was done and the betrayal, right? The symbolic, the betrayal. So so those few studies on the German Shoah illuminated or helped me guide my own analysis of the Haitian, of the Kout Kouto, which, by the way, happened before Hitler started killing the Jews in Germany in, officially around 1941 or so, right?
Thank you. I appreciate that response. And I have ordered the book and look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much for your support and enthusiasm.
It's really interesting what you wrote. And we still have another question from Ms. Gordon, but she asked me to ask you because she's currently in a working area. She said, thank you. It was very captivating. I would like to ask if you found any examples of Dominicans of Haitian descent trying to hide their Haitianness. For example, through language, the use of pronouncing perejil. How does the spiral speak to those people sharing both Dominican and Haitian identities?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Miriam, for this. I mean, the reason why I keep saying that Pîrciu massacre is a misnomer, and I am drawing from Robin Derby historical research, where the word perejil is, it was one tool that Dominican guards used to differentiate between Black Dominicans and Haitians, but it was not the only one. And as she says, there was no time to identify people with, can you speak perejil? No, you're location. Goodbye, So there was no time for linguistic differentiation, linguistic tests, number one. Number two, many of these, the victims were Dominican by birth. They were born in the Dominican Republic, raised in the Dominican Republic from Haitian parents, but they spoke Spanish pretty well. And still today, Dominicans of Haitian descent speak Spanish very well. And sometimes they don't even speak Creole because they grew up in the Dominican Republic. So that's why perejil is really a misnomer, because it brings us back to linguistic differences, ethnic differences, which is really a mask to hide the real conflict going on here. It's not between Haiti and Dominican Republic. It's between a state, an elite, and the bottom population, the Black people, poor people. And today, even the persecution are taking place against Dominicans who are Black. They're taking them in the trucks and deporting or bringing them to a detention center until they can get the money, because this is all about money, until they can get money and be released. This is a fully state-sponsored extortion. This is what's happening. So Claudio, we have a comment from my friend Claudio Mir. I'm going to read it. So Haiti is a jewel of the Caribbean, historically, politically, culturally, but the elites of both countries don't see it and don't care. You said in the book presentation last week that the issues between the two countries is an issue of the elites. There is a lot of work done outside of the country to protest Dominican authorities' policies. So what do you think we can all do to support the struggle? Yes, yes, the issues is between the elites and the working class or the marginalized population, the poor, right? Which the elites wants to keep oppressing and making vulnerable, and they don't want, especially Dominicans of Haitian descent, they don't want them to have access to vote, to the voting, to be fully citizens, so that they can't vote and they can't run for elections and they can't advocate for their cause. But at the same time, we do have massive a movement against this anti-Haitian policies of people who really genuinely care about human rights among activists and other players in the Dominican Republic who are right now working in private WhatsApp groups and Google Docs and meetings on Zoom to figure out what they can do to denounce what's going on, and also to pressure the president to to pass new legislation or new agreements and so on. I can't follow exactly what they're doing because it's a lot, and they are more versed than me in the legalese of these matters, because at the end of the day, legal issues are what it comes down to. But at the same time, is a matter of political will. So yeah, what we can do from outside is to keep supporting, to keep amplifying their voices across the world, and to keep getting support for their cause. You're very welcome, Claudio.
It was such an interesting talk. If anybody else has another question, and here we have another one. Do you want to read it, or should I read it?
Yes, Nicole Rachel Moore says it sounds like there is slow violence through a general anti-Black policy in the DR. Yeah, I will say slow and brutal, real. Right now, people are being kidnapped from their homes in the middle of the night, taken away in the street and put into a truck and separated from their families, and children being in cages, and people having their identification, legal resident little ID cards taken away from them because the military and guards who are doing this do not care. They want your money, and you look Black enough for them to beg you as Haitian and take you to the detention center and extort you. And that is not very slow violence to me. It's very brutal and very immediate, but it is supported by the slow violence of the decrees, like the decretos issued by President Abinader to persecute them, and the sentencia from 2013, and all kinds of legislation and against Haitian immigrants.
Okay, Eve, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is why I think a deeper understanding of the political context is so essential to actually understanding what is happening at the moment, and it always happens. I mean, they always say that whenever anti-Haitianism spikes, right, it's always about asking what's really going on and what's really happening under the surface, because it's always been used as a political tool, right, to divert attention or to create smoke and mirrors or to create some kind of political to forge or support some kind of economic or political interest. And that's what I've been trying to do in my own work as well, is not just look to the island itself, but also think about the transnational linkages and think about the broader the broader question of what is actually going on. I write about this a little bit, but the Dominican Republic has always positioned itself right between the US and also between Europe, right, so that it can promote its own interests. So there's always this shape-shifting going on, and this happens in terms of identity and race and positionality as well, which is why I think it's so helpful when we look at the work of people like Sophie, because it's questioning that. It's saying that it's not this like binary, it's not this, you know, black versus white. We can't oversimplify it and understand it in that terms. We have to understand that there are much deeper and more complex kind of things that are happening under the surface, but also that anti-Haitianism makes money, right? It makes money, and we've seen this in, you know, with recent Trump comments as well. This picking up at, you know, a stoking fear and stoking anxiety about this, you know, imagined or created other is something that we should all be fearful of. So really, anti-Haitianism and the understanding of it doesn't just respond to Haiti or what's happening in Haiti. It responds to so many different contexts that we can use that as a tool to understand that's happening around the world. And as Sophie mentioned, you know, the tragedies that we're seeing happening in Gaza and elsewhere is super important, which I think this book responds to anyway. So I can see we have another question from Bridget as well. So let's see what she has to say.
Yes, and the question really fits your comment. I believe it is also about the intersectionality of oppression. She says there is a gender perspective to the so-called Pacific invasion, where Haitian women are particularly targeted for misogynistic views and action. Does your book address this? Looking forward to reading it.
Thank you, Bridget, for coming. I address this gender in the massacre, the chapter about the genocide, where the images, recurring images that we have coming, Sabine Cadeau mentions a lot of that, of women dead on the Dajabon River. Their bodies are there, and then their babies on their breasts trying to nurse from the dead body of the mother. And that is, to me, is the epitome image of how Haiti itself has been feminized and feminized through a misogynistic lens of desiring for women to die, desire for Haiti to disappear. So there is that. And then, as I mentioned earlier in my discussion of the 1929 constitutional reform, the people que cruzan pero no se detienen in the 1920s or throughout the 19th century and late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century are the marchantas, las vendedoras, the women who bring their wares, right? So there is this mobility. The gender lens, the anti-Haitianism is very embedded with misogyny. The anti-Blackness is coming from the source misogyny, which is much longer in humankind history. Misogyny has thousands of years, whereas anti-Black racism has more than a few hundreds of years by comparison. And there is a work by Elsa Dorlin, a French philosopher, called La Matrice de la Race, where she discusses how racism takes the structure of misogyny to take place. And then in today's events, yes, women are targeted. The Haitian women who give birth at the hospitals, they even have a special name for them. They are parturientas. So Dominican women, when they give birth, they're not parturientas. It's a word that has been used specifically in derogative terms to shame Haitian women for having children, right? In a country that bans abortion totally without exception, in a country that does not promote birth control or sexual education, but they blame the Black women who have too many children. So they can't have abortion, but they can't have many children either. So they can't win either way.
Sounds like an inescapable situation.
Yeah. That's misogyny for you. It's very hard to escape.
Maybe in the Caribbean, this misogyny is a little more nuanced and has this Latin flavor to it, so to say, and we deal with like the machismo discourse maybe there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question?
I asked, would you say that maybe this misogyny in the Hispaniola context is a bit more nuanced, and we encounter what can be said, what can be called this Latin version of misogyny, this machismo discourse, which both affects in a negative way the women and the men? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are degrees of misogyny, right? There are degrees from wanting to kill them and destroy them and hate them to wanting to keep them in the kitchen and make children, and that's all we want from them. And we don't want them to speak. We don't want them to be smart. We don't want them to be qualified, and they have to work double to get half the credit that men get. So in general, but there are different degrees, obviously. So Haitian women get the harsher degree of misogyny because they're also Black and they're Haitian. So it's all a compounded form of hatred targeted at them.
Sophie. Bridget also thanked you. She really loved your answer. And do we have any other questions? Eve, do you want to add something maybe?
Well, I just wondered, we've still got about 15 to 20 minutes. So I just wondered, Sophie, if maybe you could speak to perhaps other chapters in your book that you didn't focus on in your presentation today, and maybe guide us through a little bit some of the content of your book to encourage people who are here today to engage with it and to learn more, really, because it's important to add, I think, because there's the knowledge of Haiti and the Dominican Republic and in the UK particularly is not very widespread, and it's something that, as you know, working on these issues, they're so central to understanding not only Caribbean studies itself, but also to opening up questions about much broader questions, right, about the Britain's position in the world and empire and colonialism and this impact. So I think there is a reason behind that, is why our education system doesn't deal with these topics, and you really have to delve very deeply to even learn about the Haitian Revolution, for example, and its fundamental importance, right, within Caribbean history. So I think your book does that really brilliantly as well, because it talks to these themes that and introduces these themes that are really, really important to also non-expert audiences. But yeah, I just wondered if you could talk through maybe some of the contents and some of the main line of argument for people who want to learn a bit more about some of this context and some of which I won't be familiar with.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and I'm glad that you find it that is accessible for non-expert people, non-academic, because that was really a concern that I have. I wanted this to be, outside the ivory tower, not just an intellectual exercise, right? But really reach out to people because, like you said, there is no much discussion of slavery or the Haitian Revolution in schools, let alone in Europe. I mean, why would they talk about this past where they were the bad guys, right? And when you talk to regular, I can speak from the French perspective. When you talk to regular French citizens, and you tell them about France having enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, they look at you like you're crazy. They have no idea that France did that. What? The country of liberté, égalité, and fraternité?
Yeah, and I mean, even the position of it to maybe the banality of it all. But, you know, thinking about tourism in the region as well, and the fact that, you know, Haiti used to be such an important tourist destination, and then obviously because of Duvalier and because of the troubles that were happening there, then the Dominican Republic has really taken itself on as being the major tourism destination for the Caribbean. But what is so telling is that most of these tourists will never, ever, ever set foot in the Zona Colonial. They'll never, ever go to a museum. They'll never learn about, you know, so it's the feeling of that, you know, that long history of violence and of occupation and of ignorance as well, right? That is just, when you think you've got it, the country gets 2 million foreign visitors a year, but really how many of them have had any kind of concept of the centrality and the absolute importance of the island in terms of world history, right? That's something that I think is a long battle ahead.
So because of the tourism industry, from the Dominican perspective, the island or the Dominican Republic is sold as a paradise on earth, right? With the beaches and all that. We don't want to talk about anything negative. So
and they've got they've also got the best PR, I think, of any country that I've seen, the best public relations, because they sell themselves so well, which I think is very, very interesting and deceptive as well.
Yeah. It creates lots of mixed feelings, because as a Dominican person too, I can tell you that, you know, I love going to the beach and eating the food and enjoying the friendship of my Dominican friends and relatives. But I'm also, you know, conflicted with what's going on in terms of the state and the anti-Haitian rhetoric spreading across social media. So my approach was to break down the academic disciplines, because the world is not divided in disciplines. We don't have, oh, this is history here. Oh, this is literature there. Oh, that's right. It's not like that. And spiritualism unites everything, unites all this social phenomenon that repeat over time and that respond to usually the same agendas from the same people, you know, in different generations. And so in my introduction, I describe what the spiral is as a concept, where it comes from. You know, I do all this discussion of the theoretical background behind it. Then I offer a recapitulation of the history of the island from an island-wide perspective, which, by the way, I never call it Hispaniola, because Hispaniola is a colonial imposition on the island. Nobody identifies themselves as I am Hispaniolan. Either you are Haitian or you are Dominican. And so I always say the island shared by Haiti and Dominican Republic, because it may be a mouthful, but it's more accurate to how people identify themselves. And so I provide that island-wide historical background so that we can move on. But I do also mention what my three main arguments are about the sources of the violent episodes that are foundational to the history and the narratives of national identity, which are, as I mentioned, the Haitian Revolution, the massacre, and the genocide of the indigenous. And you might say, well, but the indigenous moment is preceding the nations. But yes, it does precede, but it's so important to the national narratives in the 19th century, and that is in my chapter 3, because let me go back. Chapter 1, El Comegente, talks about how the Spanish side, Santo Domingo, responded to Haitian Revolution. At the same time, there were local insurrections happening in Santo Domingo that did not develop as much like the Haitian Revolution, but the Spanish authorities were very concerned, and they were calling Spain for reinforcement to protect themselves should the rebels from Saint-Domingue come over to the Spanish side. And they used this figure, un negro incógnito más feroz que cualquiera, like a black and an unknown black guy who's more ferocious. And the people call him El Comegente, the people eater. That figure keeps coming back later in the 19th century. They're going to use that figure to erase the rebellions that took place in the 18th century and call it the cannibal. And then there is a novel by Casimiro de Moya who calls it El Comegente. There's an episode in this novel where El Comegente is a Spanish guy who goes to Saint-Domingue, and then there he works with, he's a foreman of the slaves, and they put a curse on him and turn him into a monster, a Comegente. And then he comes back to Santo Domingo eating and eats people. And that story, I analyze it like creating a taboo, a psychological border between Haiti and Dominican Republic at the end of the 19th century, because the country was still dealing with an undefined border, and that gave them a lot of anxiety. And also they wanted to present Haiti as the primitive, the Black primitive, whereas Dominicans, we are civilized and white and Hispanic. So everybody, you can invest your money in us, we're trustworthy. So that's the agenda in the 19th century. Then it changed again in the 20th century with Peña Gómez, with the elections that's going on. So there is another form of El Comegente. So I'll stop so that you can read it. Then in chapter 2 is what I presented today on the genocide. And then in chapters 3 and 4, I talk about that indigenous past and how Haitian writers and Dominican writers deal with it to create their own national narrative with very different perspective. So for example, Haitians, starting with Dessalines, I call the first Afro-indigenist of the Americas. Why? Because he named Haiti using the name of that the indigenous had named the island, right? It's after that. Haiti is the original name of the island. So he founded a nation using that name in honor to them. And he also said, our revolution avenges the natives from the atrocities perpetrated on them by the Europeans. And ever since, and also he called the Haitians were les nouveaux indigènes, and there is l'armée indigène. So there is that connection between the indigenous anti-colonial fight and the Haitians' anti-slavery and anti-colonial fight. And since Dessalines, all the intellectuals and writers of the 19th century and 20th century see Haiti and Haitians, revolutionary Haitians, as the successors of the first anti-colonial fight brought about by Caonabo and Anacaona and all the chiefs at the beginning of the colonization. So there is this very tight Afro-Indigenous connection in Haitian literature, right? Then on the Dominican side, you do have that too, but with the opposite. The connection is between the indigenous and the Europeans. The Africans don't exist in this indigenous narrative. They are totally absent, and they only extol the figure of Enriquillo, Manuel de Jesus Galvan's very famous novel, so-called Indigenista, which is based on this historical figure, Enrique, who rebelled and had a community of rebels for 19 years in the Bauruco region until he was caught by the Spanish emperor's troops, whose leader told him, Enrique, that's it. We found you, and you can hide you can be a worm under the ground, and we will find you wherever you are. So you better surrender. And my advice is that you accept the terms of peace deal that the emperor is sending you. So you surrender. We will pardon you. We will give you land, freedom, and you will go after the other rebels and bring them back to us. So they turn Enrique from being a rebel into being a traitor, basically. But Galvan erases that very unsavory pact and makes it like a deal that was good for everybody and presents Enriquillo as the ancestor of Dominicans. And the nation is the product of the reconciliation between the indigenous and the Spanish colonizers, right? So between the colonized and the colonizers. So that is and what I argue in my book is that novel by Galvan is not indigenist, is totally anti-indigenist, because it celebrates the destruction of indigenous identity. Enrique becomes a Spanish subject, renounces to his culture, his language, his beliefs, and he is a subject of the emperor.
Yeah.
So there's nothing left of him of indigeneity.
No, that's a wonderful argument, super important, but also that these stories, like the Enriquillo story in particular, is the very foundation of Dominican identity, right? It's taught in schools, it's an educational book. It's like, this is what people are brought up on, is the myth of the Indio, and it, you know, the way of using the Indio myth to explain people's dark skin and their non-European, or make claim to European identity while also rejecting their non-Black Haitian identity as well, which is
so what I do in my last chapter in Afro-Indigenous, where I bring in Luis Diaz, is that I look at how subaltern communities, Afro-descendant communities, recuperate the Afro-Indigenous alliances that took place at the beginning of the colony, and manifested in spiritual ritual, you know, songs and prayers and practices and beliefs in the Indios, the Indio spirits who are going to protect them. And these are Black, Afro-descendant communities. So why are they revering Indians, right? It's because of this memory of protection, of early alliances that they had with the indigenous. And that comes up in Luis Diaz's music and poetry, which I analyze in the last chapter.
Maybe it's also because of this violence that connects them, the violence, the genocide in the beginning, and now what happens to them. We also have one final question here from Rachel. She is already in the chat. Maybe you want to ask it yourself, Rachel? Or should I?
I can ask it if I can find my way to my own question. Thank you so much for this. It was so interesting, and I look forward to reading your book. If I remember correctly, just because my own memories don't always serve me well, but there is this law that the Dominican Republic is now utilizing that denies Haitians, if I remember correctly, citizenship, utilizing their mother's citizenship as opposed to traditionally it would be the father. But I was wondering how the Dominican Republic's desire for money, as you talked about, relates to their desire to deny citizenship or to provide it.
Well, as long as the Haitian immigrants or Dominicans of Haitian descent are in a vulnerable position and don't have access to citizenship, they can be prey to all kinds of abuse, extortion primarily, and from the officers that detain them in the street and tell them, if you don't want me to send you to Haiti, you better give me 20,000 pesos, right? And that's like, what's the difference with the gangs in Haiti who are doing that to the kidnapping? It's the same thing. The difference is that it's being sponsored by the state. And the reason why the state allows that to happen is because it gives them the support of the military, the immigration officers, guards and cops that the state doesn't pay with decent salaries. And that is the way of them making a lot of money and supporting the government. It's a way of getting the political support of the military and the police to the government, right? Because they're getting their cut.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Sophie. This was really interesting and very educational, at least for me. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And I believe we should end it now, if everybody agrees.
Yeah, just quickly, I just wanted to jump in and say thank you, Sophie, thank you, Alex, and thanks everyone for coming. Please do check out Luis Diaz's music, Luis El Terro Diaz. He's on YouTube, and there's a number of videos you can catch on there, which I think will add a soundtrack basically to what we've been talking about today. And also to say thank you also to the Society for Caribbean Studies, who are now supporting these seminars and who have been wonderful in helping put these together.